Bad bosses, mediocre managers, careless coworkers will tell you how to handle them all. Hello and welcome to The On-Ramp, an ongoing series that highlights thought leadership from the Sawyer Business School in downtown Boston. My name is Areto Odaya, and today I'll be speaking with management and entrepreneurship professor Katrina Graham. One of her most popular courses in the business school is managing difficult people at work. She's going to talk about the impact of a toxic workplace and steps you can take to manage difficult bosses and unproductive coworkers. Professor Graham, thank you so much for being here. It's a pleasure.
Thank you so much for having me.
Awesome. So sometimes people get a bad boss or a stern boss mixed up. Is there an objective definition of a bad boss or a toxic workplace?
No, there's no one objective definition. There certainly can be a lot of different types of what we call quote unquote bad bosses. I think the biggest way that we can think about this is how employees feel they are treated. Is their dignity or respect being violated? And I also think that sometimes we confuse sternness with that. You can certainly have high standards, hold employees accountable while also having empathy for them. They are not in contradiction with one another. So there's no one definition, but it's really how the employees view it, the way they're being treated in the workplace.
Yeah, and so throughout your academic and professional career, what are some ways that you handle difficult bosses?
Yeah, so I think the first thing is letting go of control, that we're suddenly going to change people. We have to decide for ourselves, can we work around this? One of the best ways you can really mitigate some of the impacts is just being there and helping your boss out and really adapting to their style, while of course also holding lines around if there's certain things we're not ethically comfortable doing. One of the best ways you can do that is really just to work around them, find other sources of leadership in the organization, outside the organization, and ultimately, if it gets really bad, if there's a way to leave, that's your best bet.
Yeah, so what do you recommend if someone feels like they're being treated unfair or unkind?
Yes, so the first step, and this really depends on the situation, is it's very scary for many people, is to try to have the conversation, to raise the issue directly with the person. We often, there's different ways to do that. We might not feel comfortable depending on power dynamics, but really getting input from others, having that difficult conversation, and just letting there a chance to be two-way communication is the first step. And then of course, depending on the outcome, there's many different avenues you might take, including consulting with a third party and figuring out your different options.
What if someone is consistently being stubborn or is just not handling the situation correctly?
Yeah, so that's a really common problem, right? We deal with people you might consider rigid, they're not listening, whether they're doing things well or not, we get frustrated. So the answer is really simple, but very counterintuitive for a lot of folks, which is stop trying to convince everyone that they're wrong or that they're stubborn, and listen. And if it's a longer term approach, but if someone's very stubborn or rigid, ask them a lot of questions. Try to understand their way of thinking. And if you do that and you also share your perspective, people are less likely to be defensive, they feel heard, and just accept you might not change that person. It's really up to you whether you're willing to engage in that communication and work around it and adapt to their style. And I'm not saying you have to. But it's a really common problem, but trying to convince someone that you're right and they're wrong often backfires in most cases.
Yeah, and I mean, for people who are in group settings and things like that, what happens if the coworker is not doing their share of the work and not doing their part that they're assigned?
Yes, another very common frustration is not having someone contributing, or maybe they're not showing up. And really, again, the first step is having that conversation with them. We're often so quick to complain. We might send them a text or email and ask them maybe like, hey, how are you doing? What behavior did you notice? I noticed you weren't at the meeting. Or, the team was hoping you might find a way to contribute to this. Ask them about their strengths. Sometimes if we just ask them what's up and how they might like to do the work, we might find a solution. But without having that conversation, without being curious first, you're never gonna find a way to have that team member contribute. And again, it doesn't mean it's gonna solve the problem, but you're only gonna know if you try. We often stop before we even have that conversation.
And it's so easy to say, oh, you're being sensitive, or, oh, just deal with it. So what do you say to those people who feel like very frustrated with somebody?
Yes, I know sometimes, you might hear the complaint, oh, people are just too sensitive, they can't take negative feedback. I mean, that again is a subjective area, and there's no objective, right? There's no sensitivity police saying somebody can't react the way they react. So again, I think come at from a place of understanding, from learning. Oh, okay, this person didn't like the way I delivered feedback. What is my goal here? Is my goal to be right and they're wrong and convince them they're too sensitive? Or is my goal to achieve something or to make the organization better? And if I look at it from that lens, it's like, okay, how can I work better with this person? Where can we find common ground? Maybe it's getting to know them outside of the work task, right? Seeing your common humanity is really big. And so I think we just have to get past this idea of, yeah, not everyone's gonna view things the same way or have the same approach to things. But if we put labels on people, we're never going to learn, and we're never going to be able to accomplish what we want to together.
And you touched on this a little bit earlier, but again, what if you tried everything? You tried every strategy, you're still not finding a solution. What can people do to obviously not get frustrated and kind of continue to find a solution?
Yeah, and I mean, I think the most important thing is we don't want to blame people who are going through a really difficult situation and being treated unkindly. There's certain lots of coping mechanisms people can use, social support, again, finding those resources in and outside the workplace. And if it really is something that you have to check with yourself and see what your options are. Often for, one common theme I get is usually when I teach this class is I have one or two students by the end of the semester say, hey, I quit my job thanks to you. I'm kind of like, thanks. But really what's often happening is they're recognizing toxic workplaces where they're stressed, they're anxious, they're upset, they're not being treated well. And if you have that option, you might just have to go somewhere else. That's often ultimately the solution if these other strategies aren't working.
And as a student myself, in going post-grad, thinking about jobs, what should I do if I find myself in a toxic workplace environment?
Yeah, I think the number one thing is especially, power is the unspoken language of organizations. And if you don't have a lot of power in the organization, you have very limited capacity to fix it. Now we can play a role in that. We can advocate, and I encourage that at any opportunity. So just be a role model yourself, I think, and also recognize what influence do I have here? And the biggest thing I'd say too, going in the workplace is you're interviewing them as much as they're interviewing you. And so that can take research, maybe talking to people. But if you find yourself in that situation, again, taking the steps to protect yourself and ultimately look at your options. If you're in a truly toxic workplace, that is not the place I recommend anyone be. And I wish they didn't exist.
Well, thank you so much, Professor Graham, for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.
And thank you guys for joining us. We'll see you next time on The On-Ramp.